Good evening. I am Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Corsicana. This is July 14th, 2020. Hope everybody has had a good day. I want to give tribute this evening to a former President of the United States. Anybody who goes to my Facebook page knows that I have albums related to a lot of different people. And some people may find this ironic. I'm a lifelong Democrat, and there's only one album I have on my Facebook page that's devoted to a president, and that president happens to have been a Republican. And in my opinion, one of our better presidents. A man who wasn't in there very long. It's been truthfully said he was a man the country needed but didn't want at the time. But there's no question in my mind he left the White House much better than he found it. I'm speaking of Gerald Ford. I have in my library President Ford's autobiography, A Time to Heal. I also have a book entitled Extraordinary Circumstances, The Presidency of Gerald R. Ford by David Hume Kennerly, who at one time was his staff member. It's a photographer, a very good one. And also John Robert Greene's book on the presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Each of these books, the cover photo shows President Ford with his trademark pipe. In fact, he was the only president, as far as we know, had his presidential portrait made with his beloved pipe. And he lived to be 93 years old. During the 1970s, when in his office, I was a pipe smoker at the time. That was one common bond we had. And also, like myself, President Ford was a Freemason and a Shriner. He was the last member of our fraternity to serve in the White House. Again, he was born 107 years ago today, on July the 14th of 1913. And he served. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, but grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he was elected, I believe, in 1948 to Congress, and he served in the House of Representatives for 25 years. He has been called the accidental president because that was never his goal to serve in the White House. Actually, he had another office that he desired, and that was Speaker of the House. But during his years in Congress, the Democrats were always in the majority, so he never was able to hold that position. He ended up presiding over the Senate after he became vice president, and then he became president following the resignation of Richard Nixon. He served in Congress for many years, and he got along well with people on both sides of the aisle. He was noticed for his honesty and integrity, and he got along well with Democrats and Republicans. Then, during the scandal of Watergate, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned, and on December 6th, 1974, Gerald Ford was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. In his acceptance speech, he stated, "I am a Ford and not a Lincoln." Well, he didn't know that at the moment he was shaking hands with destiny. And a lot of us didn't know exactly what to expect. But it was during the summer of 1974 that Richard Nixon met in the Oval Office with a number of prominent Republicans, including Barry Goldwater. And he wanted to know how many votes he had in Congress when they were talking about impeaching him. And by the way, the term impeach means to bring formal charges against an elected official, not move from office. And we've never had a president forcefully removed from office. We've had 3 presidents who've been impeached. The first was Andrew Johnson. The second was Bill Clinton. The third was Donald Trump. Articles of impeachment are filed in the House of Representatives, but the trial actually takes place in the U.S. Senate. And in none of those cases was there enough votes to have the president removed. Richard Nixon would have been impeached. In fact, when he asked the visiting Republicans about his support, how many votes he had, Goldwater responded, "You sure don't have mine." And it turned out Nixon had about 10 or 12 votes in the House not to impeach. And he had 4 or 5 in the Senate not to remove. Well, with figures like that, he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he finally decided to get out while the getting was good. And based on the research I've done, I do not believe there was any deal made ahead of time. "I'll resign if you pardon me." Ford considered his options involved. And on August 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon spoke on national television. He said because of the shrinking support in Congress, he no longer had a political base there. He said, "Therefore, I will resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in this office at that time." A lot of people didn't know much about Gerald Ford or what to expect. And he made some mistakes like everybody does. Now, one of my most, well, it was in September of 1974 is when he pardoned Nixon. And I really didn't agree with that particular action, but looking back, I can see why he did it. If Nixon had not been granted a pardon, Watergate would have gone on and on for we don't know how long. Nixon had been taken to court. It would have been taken maybe a year to get it in court. A lot of tax money would have been spent on a trial. And if he was found guilty, no doubt he would have appealed. That would have been more litigation, more time, public exposure, tax money spent. And Ford said we had big issues to deal with. We got to deal with the economy. We got to deal with Vietnam. We got to deal with a lot of stuff. And so much of his time in the Oval Office was matters related to Watergate. We got to cut this off somehow. And it was on a Sunday morning. He was an Episcopalian. He went to church that morning, prayed, received Holy Communion, then went to the office and announced that he was pardoning Richard Nixon. It was about the same time he also issued another type of pardon, though it was much different. during the previous few years with controversy over Vietnam, and what was to be done with many young men who had chose jail or exile rather than serve in Vietnam. Well, in 1972, Richard Nixon saying they should be punished. George McGovern said they should be given unconditional amnesty. Now, McGovern lost in a landslide, and his birthday is July 19th, and I hope to talk a little bit about him that night. But so what happens with these young men? Well, Ford had many of his views were not that different than Nixon's, but he was encouraged to do some things to set his administration apart, to make sure he wasn't a carbon copy of Nixon. Well, he finally agreed to a compromise, and it was at a meeting in Chicago. The very conservative American Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW. They announced the plan called conditional amnesty. Those who would turn themselves in and accept a trial and agree to work, I believe, 2 years at a public service job, that charges would be dropped. And relatively few did apply. Some did, and most got it. And there were criticism on both sides. Some say the plan went too far. Some said it didn't go far enough. It was in 1976 that Democratic presidential nominee Jimmy Carter said that he would grant a pardon to Vietnam draft evaders. He got elected, and the first day in office, that's what he did. I'm saying all that to say all this. From 72 to 76, the mood of the country changed considerably, in which that kind of thing became more acceptable. And my late father, who was much more conservative in politics than I am, we were talking about that one time, and I forget exactly when this was, but it was in the mid-70s, and he made a point that I had to agree with. He said, nobody's trying to do anything to those guys now. And a lot of them drifted back to where they came from with little fanfare, little notice. But by 1976, we're ready to put that behind us, move on. And history is replete with examples of that. But let's get back to Gerald Ford. He took office, had a lot of things to deal with, including much of the residue from Watergate. And he was determined to make a difference. There was no wiretapping or eavesdropping, no scandal of any kind. Honesty was the mark of the day. And again, he left the White House much better than he found it. It was on April the 29th, 1976, that I had the pleasure of shaking hands with President Ford when he spoke at my alma mater, Baylor University. At the time, I was living in Teague, where I was employed by the Texas Department of Public Welfare, now Health and Human Services. I was at Teague a little over 2 years. Looking back, while no year is perfect, no time in one's life is perfect, those were generally 2 good years. When I moved to Teague in December 1974, I did not know a soul in Freestone County. I worked with the aged, blind, and disabled all over Freestone County. And there's not many country roads in that county that I haven't been down. And working with nursing home patients, I met a nurse at the Fairview Manor Nursing Center by the name of Deborah Bass, who eventually became Deborah Uzzle. And on February the 28th of 2015, one of my first book signings I held for the Durhams of Fairfield was at the Teague Community Center right across from my old apartment. And the newspaper correctly stated that I began my career in Teague in 1974 and now plan to retire in Freestone County. And my retirement year is 2026, God willing. But I love that job and love that community, still do. At the same time, I was working on my Master of Arts degree in Church State Studies at Baylor. I've had some frustrations over the years because people want to know, what do you do with a degree in Church State Studies? I can say this, that the education I got there was just outstanding. And I wrote a thesis entitled "The Nation of Islam, Belief and Practice in Light of the American Constitutional Principle of Religious Liberty." I've often remarked that any time you write a thesis or dissertation or a book, all of which I've done, before it's over, you eat, sleep, and live your subject matter. And but it was at 3:45 on April the 29th of 1976. I was scheduled to speak to the Church State Seminar at the Tibble Bible Building next to Waco Hall concerning my thesis. However, I received the letter dated April the 23rd of 76 from my thesis director, Dr. James Leo Garrett. Dr. Garrett passed away this last February at the age of 94. We remained friends for life, and I was honored to serve as a pallbearer at his funeral at the Gamble Street Baptist Church in Fort Worth. A wonderful man, a great mentor. But he wrote me a letter stating that President Ford is scheduled to speak at Waco Hall at Baylor next Thursday at 4 p.m. Members of the Church State Seminar want to hear the president speak. It is now being rumored that in order to get a seat, one must get there at 3 or 3:30. Would you be able to meet with our seminar at 5 rather than 3:45? Members have agreed to return from the Ford speech in order to have your thesis report at 5 until 5:50. I was more than willing to adjust my schedule. I was present for the first part of the seminar. It was an interesting presentation by a couple who served as Baptist missionaries in Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe. Dr. Garrett then said our seminar is being interrupted by the President of the United States. I was not able to get inside of Waco Hall that day, but I was among those who stood on Spade Avenue and shook hands with President Ford and listened to his speech from outside. And I have many fond memories of Ford, whom I remember as a calm, pipe-smoking president, a member of the Episcopal Church, a 33rd degree Mason, and a Shriner. By the way, it was on in 1975, February the 25th to be exact, when Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad died in Chicago. The Ford administration sent a representative to his funeral. In June of 1975, when the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas held its centennial celebration in Fort Worth, the program included a letter of congratulations from Ford, who described himself as a fellow Mason. That's long before any predominantly white Grand Lodges were recognizing Prince Hall. And I'm no doubt many white Masons criticized the president for reaching out to the Prince Hall brother. And it was a number of years later that the Grand Lodge of Michigan recognized Prince Hall. I'm sure President Ford was pleased about that. Texas now has recognition, and it's been only Well, let me put it like this. Since 1989, it's been a domino effect. There's a few holdouts in the South, but they'll come around eventually. And the day will come and we will have an end to this contradiction of a color line in an organization supposed to be dedicated to the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man. And in my 2004 book, Prince Hall Freemasonry in the Lone Star State, from Kennedy to Curtis, 1875 to 2003, I quote Ford's message to the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. On January 10, 1981, for the first time, I watched the East-West Shrine game, then played in Stanford, California, and President Ford was the host on this occasion. I was in Kaufman at the time. I was pastor of Macedonia AME Church. And I was visiting some members that day, and a very dear friend, Brother Robert Smith, he was related to some of our members. He was not a member of Macedonia, but it was rumored that he was planning on joining our church. Unfortunately, he passed away before he got around to doing that, but his services was held at our church. On that particular day, I think he died in 85, but in 81, Brother Smith and I both watched the Shrine Bowl. He was a Mason, but not a Shriner. And we both sat and smoked our pipes and listened to President Ford's commentary about the game. And as a member of the Michigan Wolverines, Ford played on the East team in the game in San Francisco on January 1st, 1935. Now, I'm not a big football fan, but I'm been a Shriner for nearly 50 years, and I'm really passionate about the Shriners Hospitals for Children. And it was on January the 17th, 2015. I normally watch the game on television, but that was a special year, a special occasion. January 17th, 2015, Deborah and I were actually able to attend the game in person in St. Petersburg, Florida. Not only the game, but the night before, we visited the banquet that was, both of the events were at Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg. And while we were there, we also got to visit the Shriners Hospital in Tampa. A wonderful, I truly believe that the Shriners Hospital is the world's greatest philanthropy. It's my #1 charity. And I consider the Shrine Game the world's greatest athletic contest in which weak legs run. Strong legs run so that weak legs might walk. And over the years, thousands of children have benefited from treatment at the Shriners Hospital. And I know that Gerald Ford was very proud to serve as MC, and he talked a lot about the research that the Shrine was doing concerning orthopedic and neurological conditions in the burn hospitals, and was talking about many of the burns is not known by that many are not caused by fire but by hot liquids. But in his Baylor speech in 1976, he said, "I'm delighted to be here at Baylor University, the home of the Baylor Bears, and its great coach, Grant Taft, to whom I had the honor of presenting the 1974 Coach of the Year Award for the American Football Coaches Association. I'm deeply grateful to have the opportunity to meet with you today, and you know, they say anything is possible in Texas. I always leave this great state with great optimism, a very positive attitude. We can be proud of our achievements and our accomplishments. Today, America's at peace. No Americans are in combat anywhere in the world. And I intend to keep it that way by right policies. We're meeting the active duty manpower requirements of the Joint Chiefs of Staff by an all-volunteer recruiting program without the draft. We're at peace. We will stay at peace because we're strong enough to keep the peace, to deter aggression, to protect our national security. In response to the question about former Governor Jimmy Carter's remarks about ethnic purity. Ford said, "I would not under any circumstances use that term because that term doesn't describe any of the policies that I have or any of the policies of my administration. Diversity is one of the strengths of America. There's an old saying that the beauty of Joseph's coat is its many colors, and that may be the strength of America." By the way, Jimmy Carter made the statement concerning ethnically pure neighborhoods and that type of thing. He got a lot of flack for it. Some people were not offended at all. I was very offended. He cleaned it up to satisfy some people. He did not clean it up enough to satisfy me. And the Sunday before the election, Reverend Clinton King, a black minister, was not allowed to visit Plains Baptist Church. And that was terrible. One colleague said, "Well, church, that was offensive, but that was minor." Not with me, it's not. Since I've devoted all of my adult life to try to break down racial barriers in church and everywhere else. And sadly, while there's been some progress, there's been a great deal of little progress. I mean, there's been some, but to end it completely, I'm sad to say it probably won't happen during my lifetime. But we can always try to do better. And regarding Jimmy Carter, let me say this. I'm also a fan of his. Once he took office and I saw what he was seeking to do, I really felt like he did a good job in the White House. President Carter impressed me much more than candidate Carter did. The election of 1976 was relatively clean. Not a whole lot of mudslinging. Obviously, they had different policies. You always want to win, and you're going to try to present yourself as better qualified than your opponent. But in later years, the two men became very good friends. I think their first, well, they really got acquainted was in October of 1981 when the two former presidents, along with former President Nixon, traveled to Cairo for the funeral of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. And it was Carter who brought Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to the peace table. But the diplomatic work that Ford did certainly laid the foundation for that. Here is a picture I really like. I call this pipe to diplomacy. Two pipe smoking presidents hitting it off real well, like the Native American peace pipe. Anwar Sadat was another hero of mine. And by the way, if you haven't seen it, there's a very good movie entitled Sadat in which Lou Gossett Jr. plays the lead role. I understand that many race-conscious Egyptians didn't like that, a black man playing Sadat, but Sadat could have gone into the African American community and blended in fine. You know, it was obvious his mother was Sudanese and from south of Egypt, part of Black Africa. And by the way, we have a shrine temple now in Rockville, Maryland called Anwar Temple, named after him. To my knowledge, Sadat was not a Mason, but I believe during his administration would have been a good opportunity to bring the craft back into it. And it's regret that they didn't go after him. He would have been a great member. And also, I have a picture right here of President Ford wearing his fez. Saladin Temple is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His father, his stepfather, but he considered him his father. His name was born Leslie Lynch, and he only met his real father one time. But Gerald Ford Sr. adopted him, and from what I hear, he was a very good man, and he had three half brothers to whom he was very close. And his father was a vestryman in the Episcopal Church. He was a Mason, a Shriner, an Elk, and a strong supporter of the Boy Scouts. And when Gerald Ford was initiated as a Mason, his three younger brothers were initiated right along with him. That had to be an awesome day uh, for them, and I'm sure their father uh, was bubbling over with joy that night to see all four of his sons coming into the craft. You know, that's a great experience for anyone. But on April 29, 1976, Jimmy Carter had not yet secured the Democratic presidential nomination. Ford's greatest challenge at the time was former California Governor Ronald Reagan in the Republican primary. Ford, Ford defeated Reagan at his party's national convention, but lost the general election to Carter. I've been studying politics for a long time, and one thing I've observed, whenever a party nominee gets a major challenge from within his party, that's not a good sign. They have to spend money, they have to devote time and strategy to try to ward off a primary challenge, and then they're weakened when they go up against their opponent. The same thing happened 4 years later when Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter to the Democratic presidential nomination. Though I realize there's other factors that are involved in this. And any time you lose an election, especially a close one, you can, to the end of your life, you're gonna wonder, what could I have done differently that would have got me a few more votes? And after he lost the 1976 election, here's what he was saying about it. What if I hadn't pardoned Nixon? How many people had voted against me because of that? What if I had kept Rockefeller on the ticket as my running mate and hadn't selected Dole? Bob, a loyal friend, had campaigned very effectively, and we had won the crucial farm states. But would Nelson have made the difference in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania? What if the economic pause hadn't hit us in September or October? What if the news, which appeared in mid-November, had come 3 weeks earlier? Did pocketbook issues determine the way people decide to vote? What if we had been able to achieve SALT II, accord with the Soviet Union? Brezhnev would have come to the United States in 1976. Would our joint commitment as a lasting peace have tipped the scales in November? And what if Reagan had been able to put aside his own disappointment and campaign more enthusiastic for me? What if we had captured Texas? And by the way, Jimmy Carter carried Texas, and no Democrat has carried Texas in a presidential race since. We'll see if Joe Biden breaks the trend this year. A lot of things could happen between now and November. But anyway, Ford lost the election. He retired very gracefully. He was a highly respected elder statesman until his death on December 26, 2006, at the age of 93. And I've seen a video of Masons marching in a procession to be part of his funeral. There were both white and black Masons involved in this. And when he was buried according to the liturgy of the Episcopal Church that he loved so much. By the way, I have never been a member of the Episcopal Church, but I have, especially during the holy seasons, I visited Episcopal services a lot during the years. Um, During my time at Ennis, I had fellowship with St. Thomas Episcopal Church since coming to Corsicana. I've had equally good fellowship with St. John's Episcopal Church, and I was able to preach there during the Lenten season of last year, and always enjoy reaching out. I don't believe anybody has all the answers. I believe God has reason, for a lot of these things, but anytime we try to say one church has all the truth, there's problems there. All of them got some truth, all of them got problems, but I do like the Episcopal Church, and I've enjoyed the various services I've been able to attend over the years. And I know it was very meaningful in the life of Gerald Ford. So anyway, he was one of my favorite presidents, and he would be 107 years old today. So I hope, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or Independent, whether you're liberal, conservative, or moderate, I hope you've enjoyed this video. And again, oh yeah, let me just, one other thing I want to read from the from his autobiography. This is on the inaugural day for Jimmy Carter. Ford wrote, there was a final farewell breakfast with senior staff members the next morning. I told them they had contributed to an administration which I think was good and which history will treat kindly. The weather that morning was windy and cold, but the atmosphere was full of hope, and the crowd gathered below the east front of the Capitol reflected that. Chief Justice Warren Burger administered the oath to the 39th President of the United States. Carter's first words were, "For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land." That was so unexpected and such a gracious thing for him to say. The crowd began to applaud, and I bit my lip to mask my emotions. I didn't know whether to remain seated or to stand, but when the cheers continued, I decided to stand and reached over to clasp Carter's hand. So anyway, happy birthday, President Ford.